The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the show. We're trying something a little bit different today. I'm going to be joined today for the hour by Dave Rubin, host of the political talk show, The Rubin Report on YouTube. Our sort of daily political wrap-up and stories will be on today's bonus show. So extra incentive to sign up for that bonus show. So Dave, it's been, I think maybe about a year or more since we last had you on. And when I announced we were going to be having you on, we received close to 500 different questions and concerns, and maybe about 50 insults, which is about the right ratio that I find for you. And we're going to dig into a bunch of this stuff. But to sort of set this up, I got a tweet from someone the other day, unrelated to this interview, who said, I like a diverse media diet. I watch the David Pakman Show on the left, and I watch the Rubin Report on the right, which was sort of surprising to me. What's your assessment now of where your politics are? Do you consider yourself to be on the right, so to speak?
Yeah, well, you're giving me a lot there to start, so I'll do the best I can here, Pakman.
Yep.
First off, the 500 questions to only 50 haters or insults, that's an extremely, for the internet in 2017, that's a phenomenally good ratio. So I want to be clear about that first. As far as that, now, I'll address it in a broad sense first, and then I'll get to your exact question. In the broad sense, the person that commented on that, that's a beautiful thing, and that's exactly what we need more of. Regardless of left, right, or anything else, or what you think about my politics or your politics, we need more people that are willing to listen to people from across the spectrum and in ways that you wouldn't have listened to people years ago, meaning do it through podcasts or YouTube or however else you do it now. And all of those things. What we need more than ever in this country, I believe, is a multitude of voices who are trying to get across ideas so that we can have the battle of ideas so we can figure out what the best way to move forward is. Now, as to the specific question of, okay, I listened to Pakman on the left, Rubin on the right. I mean, I have said consistently, we relaunched this show. I was at the Young Turks for a while, as you were an affiliate with them as well at the time. We relaunched the show where it became an interview show basically 2 years ago. It was September 9th, 2015, so I'm short about a month. And that's when I had Sam Harris on that first episode, and we did a one-on-one interview. And the second I was done with that interview, I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. You know, before that, I was doing sort of a news panel thing, and I'd have 3 guests, usually comedians, a little more like Hot Topics on The View or something. But I did that show with Sam, and I thought, wow, we bit into something important and relevant and real and honest. And I loved interviewing people. And I had done it before a little bit. I had a show on Sirius XM and some other stuff. But that's really where I shifted. That's where I started talking about these ideas of liberalism and the phrase classical liberalism, which I'm proud to say is now out there in the ether.
Yeah.
And you hear the phrase being spoken about more. I mean, nobody was talking about that. And I still have all sorts of problems with people, usually on the right, by the way, who still associate they'll say liberals this, when they really mean, they either mean progressives or they mean people of the left, which sort of gets to the heart of your question. So first off, I don't think the left-right thing really has much bearing anymore. I've said this many times, but I think the Trump the election and then the Trump presidency has tossed the chessboard up. I had Andrew Klavan on here a couple weeks ago. He said it rammed a truck through everything, whatever metaphor you want to use for it. It has created a situation where everybody is reevaluating whatever it is that they believe and why they believe it. So when you just say the typical ideas of the left or of the right, to me, it's really more about libertarian versus authoritarian. I don't mean libertarian in the political party. I mean the sense of individual liberty versus sort of state authority. Technically, if we were to get all the definitions in the old school way of looking at them, a classical liberalism, which is pretty close to libertarianism, technically is thought of as on the right side of the spectrum. So I think these things are kind of archaic ways of talking about things, but we all get caught in labels. I say it all the time. I have to use labels at some level to get ideas across, and then at the same time, as labels change, they become less useful. Which, by the way, it's one of the reasons that I don't say regressive left as much as I used to, because I think we made a point with it, and people started understanding what we were talking about. Because for a long time, people were sort of thinking a lot of the things that you and I have discussed. They were thinking these things, and they needed a label to sort of grasp what we were talking about. Now I think people understand it, so I've shifted away. Now some people use it more, so be it. But anyway, if you want to get down to the technical side of it, I would say that that true liberalism, classical liberalism, which is about the individual and live and let live, and logic and reason, I would say that that's firmly, truly in the center. Because what you're really trying to do is bring in the fringes, because you realize that most of us are somewhere in the center.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so there's a lot there. I mean, to sort of get to whether your politics have changed, because that's one of the big questions. So aside from however you label your place on the spectrum, there are many who believe your politics have decidedly changed when you used to be arguably sort of under the progressive umbrella, but you differed with some of your colleagues on issues of free speech and censorship and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to really now under the label of classical liberalism, supporting more genuinely right-wing ideas. Before we dig into any specific policy, do you believe that your views have actually changed, or are you labeling your views in a different way?
No, my views haven't changed. I've said this a couple of times. If anything, I would say on some economic stuff, I've shifted a little bit more libertarian. So on taxes, for example, or on some regulation stuff, which I'm happy to discuss if you want. But in terms of everything else, in terms of gay marriage, I'm married to a dude. He's in the other room. That's pretty for gay marriage. I'm for legalizing marijuana. I'm for euthanasia. I'm for reforming the prison system. I'm pro-choice. I'm basically for single-payer health care. These are all things that are thought of as either progressive or left or liberal or whatever. So yeah, I've shifted a little bit on some of the economic stuff because, by the way, for the last 2 years, I've sat across some brilliant thinkers and public intellectuals and professors, mostly people that have argued in front of the Supreme Court, I mean, experts in their field, who have shifted some of my views a little bit right in terms of economics. But in terms of everything else, I believe those same things. By the way, I will say this, that when I was on the Young Turks, I always considered myself liberal. I don't think you'll ever find a moment where I flat out said I was a progressive. I was around a lot of progressives, and at the time, I thought a lot of what they said made sense. But then as I sort of had my awakening, one of the things, and I think a lot of your audience will be familiar with this, and maybe you are to a degree as well, is that when you start seeing the corrosive effect of a lot of this stuff that's happening on the left right now, it undermines almost all of the rest of it at once. And once you see it, you can't stop. It's like a wave. And then you go, wait a minute, this one little thing, I think a little differently on this. And then suddenly you see why it affects so many other issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's pause on that part, because I do want to dig in more into detail on that in a subsequent part of the interview. But to get to the politics of it, the policies you describe, a lot of them, they're sort of at odds with classical liberalism. I mean, to give you one example, and I'm wondering maybe if the classical liberalism term is being used a little too loosely right now by some, and we're doing a long-form deep dive into classical liberalism that'll be out in a couple of weeks. I mean, one example would be a sort of foundational classical liberalism tenet is the government should be involved not at all in anything that the free market can provide. Now, it's not can provide efficiently or can provide pretty well, but can provide. So according to classical liberalism, healthcare is something that should be 100% in the free market. And that means no pre-existing conditions, or it costs 10 times as much if you have pre-existing conditions, or whatever it is that for-profit corporations want to do. The view you stated yourself having on single-payer healthcare, it could not be more opposed to classical liberalism. So is it possible it's maybe not the right label for you?
No, it's not possible that it's not the right label, because I know all the tenets of classical liberalism quite well, and I assure you it's not. Look, I've had many people on. I would recommend your audience check out some of my interviews with Steve Davies, with Randy Barnett, with Deidre McCloskey. These are professors at very well-known schools who've explained a lot of this stuff. Brandon Davies from Clemson, a bunch of other people. Brandon Turner. Basically, I think for this, look, we can whittle down every definition to this is exactly how you have to think if you're this or that. I mean, we could sit here and go, well, you're only a Democrat if you exactly believe this or exactly believe that.
No, but Democrat, I think that's, to be clear, Democrat is a political party affiliation, and I think that's very different than an ideology like classical liberalism, which has some pretty well-defined characteristics. Sure.
So for most of the guests that I've had on here who identify as classical liberals, I would venture to say almost everybody, actually. The easiest way I can explain it is that if you were a pure libertarian, and this is hard to pin down because libertarians are sort of all over the place. You have the wing of libertarians that don't want driver's licenses, and then you have libertarians that think are a little more realistic, and then by the way, you have ANCAPs who want absolutely no government and all that stuff. Classical liberals generally, I think, believe that the principles of the individual and of liberty and your right to do things for yourself, and free market principles, by the way, are the best way to go about doing things. But there's a realism there related to the state, which is that it exists. It has to provide certain things, especially in a country like America where we have 300 or 350 million people, whatever it is, and there has to be some balance. So I've seen many times, and this would be the view that I look, that a classical liberal position generally, it sort of takes the libertarian principle and then adds some element of realistic government involvement. So, we can whittle down to those words mean absolute necessity or whatever it is. But I think the general accepted term is that there's some government involvement, but you want to always err on the side of individual freedom, which I absolutely do.
On the issue of the single-payer healthcare, though, because I think this is a good lens, specifically because of your views on this, do you agree that single-payer would not be the libertarian perspective with a slight tweak to make it the classically liberal perspective? It is diametrically opposed to what a classical liberal would want.
Yeah, it's funny. I get invited to a lot of college things, and I'm always invited, by the way, by conservatives or libertarians usually, or people of the right, which is funny to me because you'd think it shows that they're certainly willing to talk to people who are pro-choice and pro-weed or pro-gay marriage or whatever, and I get no invites from anyone on the left. So I was doing a speech for the Students for Liberty in D.C. maybe 2 months ago, and I'm talking about all these things that I'm for, and I said something about single-payer healthcare, and they booed me. But then everyone started laughing after because it was very obvious that the whole purpose of me coming there was that we don't have to agree on everything. And then we all had a good laugh about it. And I thought, what a great moment that is, that we can all go, you know what? We still want to live in the same country. Anyway, as far as single-payer healthcare, I haven't done a tremendous amount on healthcare on the show, and I should do more, actually.
Why is that? Or maybe we'll save that for later, because I noticed that you don't talk about that, and it's potentially affecting, tens of millions of people tomorrow. You know what I mean? I was surprised that you weren't talking as much about it.
I think it's sort of ancillarily bounced in and out of the specific. What I try to do on the show is I like talking about the principles and the ideas mostly, and I try not to get caught in the sort of day-to-day, the news part of it, and especially because of the way people consume news now. It's like everything changes so quickly, and the 24-hour news cycle changes so quickly that I don't want to always be doing the catch-up on that. But whatever, that's fine. I would say that, to me, the best idea for healthcare, as I see it, would be that basically you would have the private companies would be in control because they have to decide what they have to make money. They have to have a functioning business. I do believe that's a realistic thing. At the same time, there is a piece of, do you want people to be able to get health insurance that have pre-existing conditions? Absolutely. Do you want to do things that aren't always about the bottom line? Now, this is where a libertarian might say, okay, well, it's tough for that person and they have to go to their local church or their community and help them. Now, I believe the state does have some responsibility there. I think this is a classical liberal position. So I would say the most realistic way that I think you could do this basically would be that you would have private companies that would sort of all be facilitated and exchanged with some facilitating by the government.
Isn't that Obamacare? Isn't that Obamacare basically said, we're still keeping health insurance as a for-profit endeavor, but in order to participate, you have to abide by certain restrictions, and we will also sort of regulate some portion of these plans through an exchange. Like, I'm hearing exactly what the Affordable Care Act is.
Yeah, well, first off, you can go back to my tweets and many videos that I did. I was not against Obamacare.
Yeah. No, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It's just sounding like the Affordable Care Act.
Well, I wasn't against Obamacare. I was frustrated with a lot of how they did it. I'm not someone that believes that the ends justify the means. And if you remember when Obama was running, he was constantly talking about how transparent we're going to be, and we're going to air this stuff on C-SPAN, and everyone will know. And we know it was all backdoor deals and congressmen that were suddenly retiring out of nowhere after they signed things and all kinds of shady stuff. But that's just government nonsense, which is another reason why I'm for small government as a general rule. I think that there is some overreach by the government on. I have some issue with the government forcing people to buy something. There's something there, but I can basically get over that. Look, I can tell you this. I have a very good friend who, for the last 10 or 15 years, has been a very successful doctor. I don't want to say what state he's in, but a very successful doctor. Obamacare came in, and his practice in many ways has been wrecked because he's stuck with all these regulations and doing more paperwork than seeing people and all this other stuff. Now, I know that's just an anecdotal thing, but you do hear a lot of these stories. So the basic premise, though, of what you're saying, having some exchange that the government says you have to sort of hit these certain marks, I just don't know that it's exactly been rolled out properly. I think there's a lot of evidence that it hasn't. But again, I mean, look at the day Obamacare was passed. I tweeted something that got something like 50,000 retweets, which at the time I think was one of the top 10 most retweeted things ever. So,
but so Dave, I'm trying to, I just want to, just so we can drill down. Yeah. So you're agreeing that what you described as your ideal scenario sounds like Obamacare, but your problem with Obamacare isn't how it was written, but rather that the implementation wasn't exactly as it was designed?
Well, no, there are. First off, I'm not a healthcare expert. I mean, I know everyone wants to pretend they're experts and everything. It seems to me that there are probably unnecessary regulations or expectations out of some of the insurance companies and the doctors, frankly. I'm less concerned about a giant corporation that's an insurance company that we know these companies make tons and tons of money. I'm much more concerned about the ability for the doctor and the patient to have the best relationship possible, the doctor to make the right choices, which I've heard a lot of things from several doctors that there are reasons sometimes that they can't even make the best choices that they think to do, or sometimes they'll do a procedure before they think it's necessary, all sorts of other stuff. But the basic premise of what Obamacare is, of the government facilitating the private exchanges, I don't have a problem with it. But like most things, private or public, but especially public, it could probably be done a little better.
Fair enough. Yeah. And as far as, I think that one of the big issues is if we had single payer and we had also outcome-based compensation rather than you get paid for each thing that you do, which is sort of one of the key aspects of the system we have, you would eliminate a lot of what we're seeing doctors doing. But let's put a pause on the healthcare conversation. And in fact, we'll take a quick break. And then, Dave, we will resume with you. And we just have so much else to talk about. We're speaking with Dave Rubin, host of the Rubin Report. And we'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We're continuing our conversation with Dave Rubin, who is, of course, host of the political talk show, The Rubin Report on YouTube. Growing by the day, I think is fair to say. So, Dave, let's now turn to, we've sort of talked a little bit about your political views generally, and I want to get a little bit to some of the most popular questions. As I mentioned, nearly 500 questions and about 50 insults that came in related to this interview. Some of the insults directed at you, some of the insults directed at me, lots of anti-Semitism to go around, no shortage of that ever. But there are a couple things that kept coming up, okay? One is, and I know you've heard about this, the criticism of your interviewing style. And as it generally goes, the criticism is there are people who go on the Rubin Report, they say things that are demonstrably untrue. or at minimum, highly deceptive. And Dave Rubin doesn't challenge them. So let me just sort of give you the opportunity to explain what your approach is and what underlies what some might perceive as not challenging guests when maybe they deserve to be challenged.
Yeah. Well, first, can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So, like, for example, when you had David Horowitz on and he said Obama's a communist, and he did include it in a sentence where he said a lot of things that were untrue. You could have, I guess, conceivably picked out any of those things, but it was just sort of allowed to slide where if you had a different style, you might have said, can you tell me what Obama has done that makes him a communist in his legislation or whatever the case may be? I guess that's one example.
Okay, so So first off, David Horowitz saying that Obama is a communist, that's his opinion of what he thinks about Obama. I mean,
of course,
I don't know that you could say.
It's
I don't know
factually debunkable, though, right? You could say, well, if someone is a communist, there must be something you can attribute to them that would be communistic.
Well, I think I'm not David Horowitz's lawyer or arbiter here, but I think he would argue that the policies that Obama put in place, like Obamacare, whether you agree or not, or other things, or large taxes and things like that, that he would view those as communist ideals, let's say. But anyway, putting that aside,
yeah,
my interview style. By the way, it's funny to take questions. I don't take questions as an interviewer. I don't take questions from my audience because I always feel that it's better if these things come from my head. And also, there's an odd self-selection. So if you tweet out, I'm taking questions for Dave or whatever, mostly what you're going to get is the haters, because those are the people that.
No, I know, Dave, but I mean, you know me well enough to know that I mean, the questions that I did not even pay attention to are the ones that I really think we wouldn't get anything out of. Like, as an individual, I believe I'm curious because your style is so much different from mine. Your style might be better. I mean, there's no rule that my style is better. I'm curious what your approach is in terms of style.
Yeah, and believe me, I'm not accusing you of anything. I just think there's an interesting. We always forget about this interesting self-selection, which is important because in a day of social media, you only hear from the screaming people.
Of course.
And I even see this when I get emails. I get tons of email every day. People saying really nice things. I get people, I get Muslims in Saudi Arabia and Christian conservatives in Missouri saying almost the same exact things to me. And then, but the ones that stick out in my head are the ones where people are just telling me to go, F myself repeatedly. Yeah. Okay, put that aside. My interview style, I've said this many times, is I believe that the best way to interview somebody is to really be able to hear what they think. And the way you do that is you listen. Now, when David Horowitz, in this specific instance, when he said that communist thing, I was in that particular case, I was about to stop him, but you're right. He then did quickly. He sort of said it. It was right at the top of the interview. He kind of flew right into something else. And then the conversation just went from there. I do remember thinking in the interview that I wanted to get back to it, but in the course of an hour conversation, or I think that one was almost an hour and 20 minutes, sometimes something's going to get lost. My belief is that if you let people speak, you can either figure out if they know what they're talking about or not. I think one of the problems that we have right now in mainstream media and, 10 guests in little boxes screaming at each other and all this, one of the things that it's done is that it's made it so that everyone talks in sound bites. I've done some of these cable news shows. I think you have. Even when I do those, if you only have 5 minutes, you got to say things real quick. And also, if you want to get booked again, you got to sort of say it in a passionate way and blah, 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 and over the top and all this stuff. This is terrible for public discourse. It's terrible for the extrapolation of ideas. And it's terrible for a real dialogue that we should be having. So my belief is that if I sit across from somebody and I really listen to them and listen to them say what they think, then I try to ask the right questions to figure out why they think that. But my goal is not, unless I'm having something that's closer to a debate, which, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had Michael Shermer, who's a skeptic, and Dennis Prager, who's a believer, and we talked about morality and God. It's more, I believe it to be more of a conversation than a debate, because I think that's just a more helpful way to view it. But my view is let these people talk, and you can tell because I don't think my audience is stupid. I think my audience is really bright, as I suspect yours is as well. When someone doesn't know what they're talking about, or when they blatantly lie, they will hang themselves. You can see it. They will wrap the rope around their neck and they will hang themselves. So I try to ask the right questions to get the most out of them.
Yeah, I get that. And I mean,
said,
I think maybe it's just a difference in approach, right? But like, I would imagine maybe you're right that David Horowitz thinks Obama's a communist because of Obamacare and taxes. But then I would say, this is my instinct, I would say, well, what taxes are you talking about? And then it would be like, oh, he's a communist because he allowed the top income tax rate to go from 36 to 39%. I mean, it's like so my interest would be in, if there's an assertion made that is I didn't know the president was a communist. That's interesting. How do you define that? I feel like we would get a lot out of that, and it's just a difference in approach, I think, is what we chalk it up to.
Sure. And listen, I always say to people will say, well, I don't like the way you do this or do that. I'm like, well, is someone forcing you to watch this thing? If you've got someone that you like better than me, watch that. Or if you think somebody's a better interviewer, that's fine too. This is just what I'm doing. I like it. People happen to like what I'm doing, which is great. But yes, by the way, in that interview, I thought we were going to spend almost, David Horowitz was a hardcore lefty, a child of communists, who was a lefty Berkeley guy in the 60s. Who then evolved, and now he's thought of as hard right. I think he's pretty
hard right. Maybe not diamond, but whatever is the next softest stone.
Yeah, he's right, no doubt about it. But my purpose of that interview, he's written many books of. I had recently done that video only a few months before on Prager about why I left the left and why I don't think liberalism has anything to do with the left. And Horowitz had sort of been through that experience many, many years before, has written many books about it, wrote an article about it during Reagan's re-election. So I really wanted to focus on that. So occasionally something's going to get by. It's just how it is. And by the way, my friend and who I'm thrilled to call a friend and honored to call a friend and mentor, Larry King, a lot of people used to say that when Larry, he's still doing interviews now, and I love him, and I just saw him last week.
Yeah.
But when he was in his heyday, let's say in the 80s and 90s on CNN, a lot of people said, well, he doesn't attack the people the right way. He doesn't follow up the right way, blah, blah, blah. I think my follow-ups are actually pretty good. And I think, as I said, by subtly talking to people, you can get them to explain themselves sometimes into a corner if they don't know what they're talking about. But, everyone's going to have their critics, and I'm actually completely okay with that. And by the way, maybe in 5 years from now, I'll look back and go, oh, I should have done that a little different. Or, everyone evolves and figures things out. I think the quick rush to judgment, I think, is kind of unfortunate, but it's all right.
Hey, I've got no shortage of interviews I look back at and say, what on earth was I thinking that day? But unfortunately, I can't redo those. A lot of those people don't talk to me anymore, sadly. No, I'm kind of kidding. But no, certainly looking back and wishing I had done things differently, I think, is a common thing. We're talking with Dave Rubin, host of the political talk show, The Rubin Report, on YouTube. More after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Let's pick up our conversation with Dave Rubin, host of the political talk show, The Rubin Report, on YouTube. So I thought it would be interesting, Dave, to talk a little bit about, because you're increasingly not doing this on your show deliberately, as you talked about, in order to stay away from the sort of 24-hour news cycle. Generally speaking, we're 6 months into the Trump administration. How do you assess this presidency so far?
I think it's, unfortunately, it's become so polarizing, even talking about Trump, that making an assessment that's a clear, honest assessment, no matter how you do it, you're gonna get some hysterical stuff. But I'll do the best I can.
Yeah.
So first off, just to be clear, I did not vote for Trump. I voted for Gary Johnson, and I should be judged accordingly. I did videos on how to stop Trump. I talked to people that I admire at the highest levels, such as Sam Harris, on why you shouldn't vote for Trump and what his fears were about Trump. The week before the election, I had Hillary Rosen on, who's a progressive pundit and does tons of work with the DNC about why she hated Trump. Then I had not plenty of Trump people, but I had a couple Trump people on, including Scott Adams, who I think was the best public advocate for, if you wanted to vote for Trump, why to vote for Trump. Anyway, I did not vote for him. My feeling was, after the election, my feeling was that the fact that the chessboard, as I described before, has been thrown up and everyone's reevaluating things versus that if Hillary had been elected, the screws that had about all the stuff that we talk about mainstream media and the corrupt politicians and all this stuff, those screws would have been tightened. It would have been really bad for independent media people. It would have been bad for just the slow degradation of society that we're seeing and discourse. All the screws would have been tightened against us. So Trump, although I did not support him, by throwing this chessboard up or driving the truck through it or whatever you want to use to describe it, I think that has created a net good in that right now there are more people talking about politics, reevaluating what they think, getting engaged, whether for him or against him, than I've certainly seen in my lifetime.
Okay, so let's pause there briefly because you've just said a lot. I think you're about to get to the parts where we're going to disagree. But so far, you've said something I've been saying for a while, which is if Hillary Clinton had won, we would have seen significantly lower engagement in politics. You would have seen many on the left sort of say, hey, we've got a Democrat in the White House, so we can sort of tune out for 4 years, which would have led to a disaster in the 2018 midterms. And the reality is that as someone who is center to center right in Hillary Clinton, which I believe her to be, I think it actually would have not been particularly good for the left, which I consider myself to be a part on. So far, I agree with you. The Trump presidency and what I see as the endless scandals have really reinvigorated activism in an interesting way. Not exactly what you said, but I'm sort of agreeing with you here.
Yeah, and I think that's all legit. And also, that fits within the things that I care about. The things that I care about are talking about the ideas, talking about the principles. Again, not necessarily every day-to-day decision or monitoring his Twitter so that I can start getting outraged because now there's media companies that literally spend all day waiting for him to tweet so they can write about how outraged everyone is. So they're doing pre-outrage before people even have a chance for outrage. Now, as far as the actual presidency, I guess we should spend a minute on Russia first, just because that's what everybody seems to go to. Now, look, it seems to me that they haven't been able to pin anything directly. A month ago, it was all the Comey stuff. That didn't seem to work out. 2 weeks ago, it was all the Trump Jr. stuff. That didn't seem to work out. This week, I guess there's some Manafort stuff. We'll see if that works out. If we were to go on the assumption for a second, I'll do it both ways for you. If we're going on the assumption that Trump did somehow collude with Russia, then what you're saying is that technically we should be at war with Russia right now, that you'd have to then depose Trump and, of course, Pence, and then I guess you then install the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Now, in a lot of ways, by doing that, you'd have a worse person for the Democrats because Paul Ryan, by most estimations, especially economically, is certainly to the right of Trump and maybe on some social stuff too.
Yeah, but Dave, let me, I don't want to interrupt you, but only because we've done the Russia stuff up and down. I'm more curious, like, for example, on the stuff Trump has actually done, like not whether he colluded with Russia, but is there like a particular policy or something Trump has done that you think is really good? And or what has he done that you think is really a disaster, if there's anything? Like, what do you see as the highs and lows of the 6 months?
Yeah, just give me 30 seconds on the Russia thing just to wrap that up, though, because my point is that if you're saying that there was collusion or they knew about all this, we are in effect at war. I mean, could there possibly be a bigger act of war than installing a president? So what you're saying is that if it would then be President Ryan or we'd have to redo an election and get Hillary, I mean, the first thing we would have to do is go to war with Russia. I do not want to go to war with Russia. I don't think there's any reason to go to war with Russia.
But hypothetically, Dave, would you say going to war with Russia is so bad that we should allow an illegitimate president if it were determined to be such?
No, because I believe in evidence.
Good.
No, I believe in evidence and logic and reason. So if one day, if tomorrow, literally, the second I hang up with you right now, if I go on Twitter and we figured it out. We actually got the trail. It's figured out Trump was installed or the Russian government actually colluded to, and then we had to go ahead and do that. Well, then, of course, I don't want a Russian puppet. But all I'm saying is you need evidence. Yeah. And I think we have a lot more hysteria than evidence. Okay, so that's one thing. Okay. So as to your other question, the specifics of the policies. Look, when George W. Bush was president, I was against executive actions. When Obama was president, I was against executive actions. When Trump, who's now used a ton of them, I've been against them. We have 3 branches of government. We can do a little poli-sci 101. The legislative branch is supposed to write the laws. The executive branch signs them into law. That's the president. And then, of course, the Supreme Court or the court systems figure out if these laws are legal. The idea that we're doing so much through the executive branch, I think, is horrific for democracy and for the rule of law and for how this country is supposed to operate. So the fact that he is so willing to do that, and by the way, it shows you the limitations of this silliness. So when Obama did all this stuff with electronic pen or whatever he did, well, guess what? Because it didn't go through the legislative process, it all got reversed by Trump with the sign of that same pen. So I think the deferment of power, which, by the way, everyone's culpable in this. We the people are, but Congress, which doesn't pass laws anymore and doesn't have real debates and really figure out what they're trying to do. They're very good at investigating themselves and investigating other branches of government, but they don't seem to be able to pass laws and function the way that they're supposed to and be the representatives of the people that they're supposed to be. So that my main issue with him is that obviously Trump is a wild card in that I don't know what the Trump the political ethos is, other than it's for Trump. I get, there's this "Make America Great Again" or "Drain the Swamp" or all those things, but that to me is not a political ethos. I care about ideas. I want someone to come in and say these are the principles that I believe in, and this is how I'm going to try to govern. And I simply don't know what that is. I don't know what Trump's moral center is. If there was a real crisis, if there was a horrible terrorist attack, or if there was a missile crisis with North Korea or something, is Trump the level-headed person you want dealing with this? Now, you can probably, and his people would make an argument that he's put in people like Mattis that would do these things well, and he would defer to them. Okay, that's possible. But my biggest issue with him is that I just don't know what his political beliefs truly are, other than sort of the day-to-day machinations of playing the media and playing that fight. And I don't think that that's great for democracy.
But has he not done anything like his tax policy proposal or what it is that he seemingly wants, although who really knows? It seems like he doesn't even, now it seems he confused health insurance with life insurance this entire time, but what he claims to want to do about health insurance or whatever. Is there any policy idea that he's put forth that you say, that's what I disagree with the most, it's a disaster?
Well, the tax stuff I don't particularly disagree with. This is we started the interview, I said I've shifted a little right on taxes. I believe you have the right to keep as much as you earn, as much as you can as you earn. Now, I do believe we need to pay into the system to have roads and social services and things like that, which, by the way, there are some libertarians who don't. Mm-hmm. So I think this is something that you could couch in that classical liberal avenue. But lowering taxes as a general rule, I'm completely for.
Even if it's in a way, even if it's in a way that would be bad for the economy.
Well, you'd have to.
Well, I guess what I mean, yeah, that's sort of vague. I mean, what I mean is, we have nothing we can point to that suggests sort of supply side stimulus by tax cuts for the very rich is good for the economy. We have periods where it's been done and it hasn't been acutely bad, but there's no evidence that it's good. So for me, I would say, okay, there's the question of what's ethical or moral, and there's also the question of the economic impact of it. That's sort of my background. So I would say it's hard for me to support something that would be economically damaging.
Well, I don't know that there's any direct evidence that it's economically damaging, but also we would have to whittle through, and we could do this in a week or so if you want, we'd have to whittle through exactly what the tax plan said. Mm-hmm. But again, as a general rule, I want you, David Pakman, as a small business owner, which you are with employees, to pay the least amount of taxes that you can so that you can hire more people, so that you can build a better studio, so that you can invest more in your operation and bring the goodness that is you and your operation out there. I know this as a small businessman now. If I had been being taxed higher right now, I had massive capital costs to build this studio and do all this stuff. By the way, I pay 100% of my employees' health insurance, 100%. I also give, my director gets a cut of our YouTube rev. I do all the things. I try to put my beliefs into practice.
But that's the confusion for me, Dave, because those capital expenses are tax deductible. So if the tax rate goes up for you as an individual, if you've got pass-through income, or for the business tax rate, it doesn't matter what the business tax rate if you want to spend money on capital, because you don't pay taxes on that. Actually, it encourages you to spend money on capital to have a higher tax rate.
So I understand what that argument is, and I would argue at the same time as that, that having every one of us, however much you earn, it is your money. It is your money. We get taxed in all kinds of other ways with sales tax and everything else. I pay payroll tax and blah, blah, blah. And I would say the best way to, if you're on the left or you're a progressive and you hate Trump and you hate what this government has become, I don't think that the best answer is to topple the government and destroy this incredible experiment, which is what it is, this American experiment. I don't think the best way is to destroy it. I think the best way is to rein in the power that it has over us. And one of the ways you can do that is by giving it less money. I think that the government could function a lot slimmer and trimmer. I think actually you could probably get most progressives to admit that the government is a giant waste. But often they'll tell you how much they hate the government, and then the solution is more government or more taxes. I would say the only way to really control this stuff is to tighten the strings on the finances, and you have the right to keep as much as possible of what you earn.
Fair enough, and that's more of an ethical argument than an economic one. I think you would agree.
I would have to look at I suppose in this case, I'm making the ethical argument, which I think if things were more done on the grounds of ethics, than sort of staring at numbers and projecting things, and the CBO, which projects things for 20 years and is always wrong about everything, or all the pundits who project things are always wrong, and all the polls that are always wrong. I think doing some things based on ethical principles might actually have some more long-term positive benefits to society.
All right, let's pause there. We'll be back for our few remaining moments with Dave Rubin, host of the political show, The Rubin Report on YouTube. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Sticking with us is Dave Rubin, host of the political talk show, The Rubin Report on YouTube. We've talked Trump, we've talked classical liberalism, we've talked about so many different things. Okay, so Dave, I sat through what felt like a very enjoyable, endless hours of Rubin Report. And there's a couple very specific things I want to touch on because I feel like they might be attacks on me personally, not directly, but de facto. You said in an interview, with Ben Shapiro, that liberalism is basically a mental disorder. What did you mean by that?
I don't think I said liberalism. I might have said progressivism.
Or maybe you said the left is basically a mental disorder. I think the idea was progressivism, the leftism, whatever the case may be, is basically a mental disorder.
For the record, if I said liberalism, then it was an absolute brain freeze, but I'm 99% sure I didn't say that.
It may have been before. It may have been before you started, before you shifted language on it. It was a little bit ago.
Yeah, I don't think so, though. But anyway, I'm sure that some of the internet sleuths around here will find it. I'm pretty sure I said progressivism.
Okay.
Well, first off, it had nothing to do with you,
No, I know it didn't personally, but I am curious, what about progressive ideology strikes you as being a mental disorder?
Okay, so first off, I said it in a glib way. Do I think it's an actual mental disorder? No, I don't think it's a mental disorder that should be studied. And I would like to study a couple of these progressives, but I would study some conservatives too. And one, you could probably figure out that their brains are wired a little differently. Okay, fine. So putting that aside, I was being glib, obviously, but the point that I'm trying to make is that it's sort of what I just said to you in the previous segment. If your issues are think about all I was on TYT for years. Everything's about the government's horrible, everyone's corrupt, everyone's evil, corporations, money is destroying everything, billionaires, blah, blah, blah. What's your answer? Make the government bigger, tax people more, force the government to do more, blah, blah, blah. That seems antithetical to logic and reason. So yes, it is not a mental disorder, but I think basically if you could get a group of progressives to sit down and not scream at you that you're a bigot and a racist and a homophobe, which, by the way, I'm sure that there are people that use those slurs on you, even though you are of the left and consider yourself a progressive. I think if you could get some people to sit down and really talk about ideas and these principles and the philosophic underpinnings of the things that we're talking about, I think you could get people to understand that if your problem is the corruption, the problem is the money and all of those things, then stop making the problem bigger. That this isn't about what the founding fathers intended. They intended a very weak federal government and local control and local power and state power, and I'm for all of those things. So yes, the comment was done glibly, but I assure you it had nothing to do with David Packman.
Well, I think that this is where, we sort of get to what I think is my core disagreement with you, aside from like really specific policy things. Like it seems like we're sort of in a different place on tax policy, for example. Sure. We probably don't agree exactly on what the size of the government should be. But you and I have talked privately about our concerns with the sort of speech policing, trigger warning, safe space stuff. We've both talked about that. We've expressed concern about some knee-jerk positions that don't seem fact-based on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, et cetera. I think it's a matter of degree that I think you believe that those issues are much bigger among the left than I perceive them to be. And I've talked about the college campus stuff that's going on, but I still think it's limited to a particular type of mostly, liberal arts colleges. I don't think it's the major issue that some of your guests make it out to be. Are we sort of having a disagreement on the degree to which these issues are a problem?
Yeah, so I would say that's a fair place to have a disagreement, which, by the way, I love having a disagreement. Pac-Man, I like you. I consider you a friend. You were going to do my show if you were going to be in LA last week. It didn't work, but we'll get you in here. The whole point of this experiment, as I described it before, of America, is that we're supposed to disagree on these things. We're supposed to disagree and be able to walk away and realize that we want to live in the same society, because I don't want to kill you for your beliefs, and hopefully you don't want to kill me for mine. So as for the free speech stuff, no, I don't think that I'm overstating it or that my guests are overstating it. This idea of the trigger warnings, of the safe spaces, of the speech police, of deplatforming Richard Dawkins at Berkeley, which is happening on August 7th. He's been deplatformed. I'm actually interviewing him in New York at the 92nd Street Y on August 8th. They haven't stopped us yet, but I'm sure there will be people that aren't happy that we're doing that. This kind of insanity, stopping Jordan Peterson from speaking. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about what happened with Brett Weinstein up at Evergreen State. So Evergreen's a great example, by the way, because this is supposed to be the most left. You could argue that this is the most left college in America, or certainly in the top 10. So you would think that they would have all this harmony, that these ideas of non-racism and plurality and all of this stuff and multiculturalism would have worked. But the students there would have you believe that this is some sort of insane, racist, crazy place. Brett Weinstein was fighting racism. He was fighting segregation on campus.
No, I get that. And I defended him. I mean, I got a call about it a couple of weeks ago and I defended him. And, a lot of my family is college professors. And I've got an announcement to make about a college involvement that I'm going to be having. And from everything I'm looking at, there are these several dozen examples that you cite. But the idea that the left at large has been taken over by this, it's like I went to the Women's March rallies here in Boston, and there was about 10% stuff that I thought was totally unproductive and a shutdown of attempts for open debate. And it was bad, and I'm against it. But I'm just not on board that it's a problem to the degree that you think it is. And I think it's really easy to look at these isolated incidents and believe that it represents everybody on the left, but I'm just not seeing it.
Well, first off, I've never said it represents everybody on the left. It represents what the mainstream left has become, without question. Now, we can just disagree on the percentage there, and that's fine. But look, we know that they've done a zillion studies on it. I don't want to quote the number wrong, but that's something like 80 or 90% of professors in America are liberal to left. Now, it depends what you mean by liberal, of course, in that case. But we know that the conservative viewpoint is not being taught in colleges. And by the way, it's leaking into not just the humanities, it's actually leaking into the science stuff. And I was at a conference with about 400 college professors in Dallas a couple of weeks ago, and many people were talking about that. So I've talked to tons of professors about this. I would recommend if you can get Jonathan Haidt on your show, I think he's doing the best work on this, and run something called the Heterodox Academy, which is about getting more diversity of thought at college campuses. But when I go to college campuses, I get kids from every walk of life and every color and sexuality and all that stuff, all that diversity that the left loves. I care about diversity of thought more. But I get kids saying that their teachers are telling them to use certain gender pronouns. They say, well, I'm not against trans people, but if I see someone and they happen to look like a man, I'm going to say he or him, and I'm not trying to offend anybody. And they want them to use Z or Z or whatever the hell it is. That these ideas which are taking root in the left, this strange alliance with Islam, all of this stuff that's taking root in the left is not being countered by anyone on the left. Actually, anytime someone on the left tries to counter it, they're kicked out. And I think you can probably speak to that yourself. And certainly,
listen, I get criticized. No, there's no doubt. I mean, I'm on the left and I counter it. I've not yet been kicked out of any place. None of my college speaking events that are planned for the fall have been canceled so far. I mean, if it happens, I'll absolutely tell you, as well as my audience, you know?
Yeah, I don't know what your specific criticisms have been that they would lead them to kicking you out.
Yeah.
But as a general rule, there is no question in my mind that people that are thought of as traditionally right at the moment are being more tolerant of other ideas than people of the left. It's just, I see this in every walk of life. I also fear that the biggest problem we have right now is that the ideas of the left, of a bigger state, of taking more, of the collective versus the individual. I would recommend your audience watch either of my interviews with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who does a wonderful explanation of the individual and why we have to care about individual rights as opposed to collective rights.
Yeah.
These ideas of the left, I think, are a far bigger, because they've taken such root with young people, I think they're a far bigger threat to the future of this pluralistic, wonderful society that we have than anything that I see coming out of the right at the moment. You could actually make lots of arguments that the right has changed. There's virtually no one on the right that cares about gay marriage anymore. That's a pretty significant thing.
You should see the people that write to me, Dave. You should see the people that write to me. No, listen, I mean, I think that's listen, what we've now gotten to the maybe biggest disagreement that we have, which is I really believe that the opposite of what you just said is true, which is that these are relatively sort of compartmentalized problems on the left. And unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time. I think the audience will not be shocked to hear that we disagree on that. But okay, yeah.
Give me 30 seconds here. Who on the left, besides you, is calling this stuff out? Who is calling out this crazed intersectional lunacy of the Dyke March? And who's calling out Linda Sarsour and all that? You know what? They're not. They're actually tweeting more and more. I stand with her, Bernie and Van Jones and all of these people. So who is doing it in an effective way, calling out their worst elements?
I don't know. I don't know any of those people. I'm in my silo here in Boston.
But think about that, and that's why I'm saying they're being led by their worst elements because people are afraid to step up because they'll be called racist and bigoted and all that other shit. So that's the part that's why I believe that it is so corrosive and it is silencing people in a really dangerous way.
Dave Rubin, host of the political talk show, The Rubin Report. I don't know whether we've solved any problems during this conversation, but it's been fascinating, and I think that just having it is something that hopefully my audience will enjoy. Dave, thanks for taking close to an hour of your time to talk to me today.
My pleasure, Pac-Man. Let's do it again.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.